Welcome in, everybody. You are listening to the Authority Podcast here on the B Podcast Network. Thanks, as always, for being with us. Happy to get us back to a conversation here on science of reading, a topic we've covered certainly here on the show before. It's been a while, so it'll be good to revisit it. And we also have a returning guest, Lacey Robinson. Lacey is CEO of UnboundEd and Core Learning Board Chair. She sets the organization's vision for transforming instruction to ensure every single student succeeds and thrives. A former teacher, principal, and professional development specialist, Lacey has devoted her career to empowering educators to break the predictability of historic achievement patterns. She's a leading national voice, in fact, on addressing the predictability of students' educational outcomes, and was named to 2023's Forbes 50 Over 50 list in recognition of her trailblazing leadership. Her book, Justice Seekers, which she was on the show previously to talk about, was released in July 2023. It's a love letter to teachers, inspiring us all to recognize that justice is found in the details of teaching and learning. She frequently serves as a featured keynoter, and her personal literacy journey is shared on Emily Hanford's Sold a Story podcast. I'm sure some of you have heard that. Very popular podcast there and really well received, right? So if you listen to it, you may have heard a little bit about that. You may have heard our previous conversation here. And if not, you're hearing today. So Lacey, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ross. Thank you for having me back. It's exciting to be back on.
Yeah, it's great to have you back here, and I'm looking forward to having another good conversation here. And as I introduced there, we're talking science of reading, and it's a topic that you've been discussing a lot, focusing on sharing your own story. And something I'd love to ask, I've had a chance to ask some other reading experts about this, and I always get interesting answers to it. Sometimes surprising ones, sometimes seemingly obvious, but yet why are we not doing it? And it's if we've known for decades about the science of reading, its effectiveness is proven, and there hasn't really ever been a lot of dispute around that. Why have we deviated from it? Why do we keep needing to have this conversation of getting back to the science of reading if it's always proven out that it's effective?
Yeah, so I kind of take what I like to call balcony level sort of view around the answer to this. I mean, we could start at the basics, what most people go to. Most people say, well, the marketing around the science of reading wasn't done correctly. People walked away thinking that you were only talking about phonemic awareness, that you weren't looking at the other 5 components or essential components that are needed to be a developing reader. People will also say, like, well, educators have a tendency to do what's easiest. I actually kind of refute that. I don't believe that's necessarily true. I think educators do what they have access to, both knowledge and material wise. And I think given all of the demands that they have on them, to assume that an educator has an additional whatever hours a day to go do their own research on how to teach a specific or use a specific methodology is a huge erroneous assumption. And then intrinsic interest, right? Which is sort of that political take on it. And so I think starting there with the intrinsic interest is usually where I start to climb up on the balcony to answer this. I actually think that part of the reason why the science of reading, and let me say this, the ensuring that our teaching core is prepared to meet our students where they are and take them beyond, has a lot to do with the reckoning that our nation has been having around what is the purpose of education.
Right.
Right. And like what is in fact our nation's belief about the role of education, not just in the individual's life, but in their community, and most importantly, our democracy, right? If you think about Horace Mann and what his push was around public education and why he was put sort of his stake in the ground that all folks that are in the United States, regardless of their nationality, regardless of where they live, everyone in the United States needs to be educated, because it is the education that then develops the citizen. And the citizen then upholds or ensures that a democratic society is flourishing and continuing to innovate and grow. But you have folks on the other side who don't necessarily see education as the valve for citizenship and rooting democracy. You see it as education as a means to give evidence that we live in a country that inevitably says that if you work hard and you focus, that you too can be successful. And this is the American dream. And so I think when you look at those two pieces, that's one of the reasons why we kept sort of circling the drain around the science of reading, or is it the 3Q system? Is that we haven't inevitably asked the question and answered it and stood on the answer in this nation. What is the role of education for the United States? One little caveat I'm gonna add: when you look at other nations, they've answered that question. They've answered that question. So that's part of my longest short version of why it really has sort of weebled and wobbled. I believe it's steady now for various reasons, but I don't believe we've ever really answered that question.
Yeah, and there's so many components to that, right? That the discussion around the purpose of education, it should be a productive, I mean, I guess I could go into it and say it should be there should be a clear response to it, but at the very least, it should be a productive dialogue and some, some things that should be stable, some things that might evolve. And yet, I think it's difficult to have sometimes because I don't know if all of the competing viewpoints always have a viewpoint. I guess if that makes sense, as far as like if there really is an alternative presented to what the purpose should be, if we think like whatever it is, what's the default or what's been established, is if there's something incorrect about it,
Yeah.
what is that? What should it be instead? How are we making an affirmative case for that?
Yeah.
And that just seems to be missing a lot. And it's with so many things in education. I mean, a lot of times I think like the positive and the negative of it, when there is some kind of, you know, political shift or something of that nature, is like kind of the good and the bad thing is that very few people in any position of real leadership have a sustained interest in
Yeah.
seeing through any, so it's like the good
Or
thing
their or
is
their interest.
whatever is happening right now will go away. The bad thing is
Yes.
like we actually do need people who are interested to make things happen. So you're
Yeah.
kind of just weathering those storms. But I do think it's like, okay, if we think that the purpose is not, to sustain and strengthen thriving democracy through informed and educated citizens. Okay, if you think that's not exactly right or that's incomplete, what's missing from it? What should it be? How do we make that happen? Like, are there certain things we can at least agree on? And I just don't know if that's always happening.
Yeah. And I would say that their interest gets competed out, I think. When you look across, we've certainly had leaders of this nation of all parties have a focus around education. I think the other piece is, and I think in its simplest form, when you think about the purpose of education, in is it to develop its citizens to uphold the democracy, or is it just really a social experiment in which if you come out on the right end of it, you will have the skill set to be a thriving, prosperous citizen that then can help support, its democracy. And I don't necessarily, when I start to have this sort of, I call it a nerd fight with someone around this, I have a tendency to walk in the middle of the road. Like, I think there is room in our halls of education for both, right? That we can at least attempt to allow each student at the end of their K-12 track, whether it's private, public, or charter, to come out with a sense of, one, I can read, write, think mathematically, critically analyze, and decide my lot in life. And I can, with a purpose, hold some sort of social responsibility in my community, in my city, my town, my nation. But ultimately, I feel united with other folks to really ensure that this state, that these United States forever stands on its foundation of a democratic or a democracy. So I think there's a way for us to do both. And I think that unfortunately, because we don't take time out to have conversations like this, we oftentimes try and figure out what is the quickest, most assured route to give us data that we are, in fact, educating the masses or making some sort of concerted effort. But that's my nerd fight version of that.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting conversation, and even in having versions of the conversation frequently, it's like I'm still thinking of new things and different things that haven't come to mind before. I'm thinking about what it looks like to have confidence in it's almost like trust the process, like confidence to educate, confidence that if we
Yes.
have a predisposition toward informing and toward making information available, doing so with the appropriate guidance and right expertise to facilitate the process of learning, that it will lead to better outcomes via like critical thinking, right? If we're going to keep talking about skills like critical thinking as these important foundational, future ready skills and life skills, that requires, I mean, freedom to to do so, right? And access, and it's only, largely when there is a distrust of a system or a source of information, that there's these, I guess, the aversion to the education system or to becoming educated, when it's like there's something they're not telling us, or there's too much of a control or an ideology behind this, whatever it is, right? Because this certainly transpires at all parts of different ideological spectrums, that there's something that they're trying to force us into versus representing the fullness of what's out there and what's available, letting me think about what that means to me, form my own perspectives on it, letting those change and evolve over time through dynamic interaction with people and with sources, right? But it starts with like being confident that if we like do the right things, that the diversity of human experience and insight right, is going to lead to people who do a lot of different things with that information. But when we're either afraid that, oh, if we teach somebody about this, then they're going to do whatever, or anything like that, that's the surest way
Yeah.
to ensure that, like, I'm going to think that there must be something to that, because you're trying not to tell me about it, or you can't. It's almost like molding and shaping minds that gets talked about is probably not really any like the right thing at all, right?
Yeah.
Because you actually can't shape it. You have to let it shape itself, and then you do that
Exactly.
via really facilitating, the acquisition of knowledge, and doing so as the educator, as the adult. Like, you have the perspective of experience, and you can certainly, you should be offering good guidance around that. It's not just like go on YouTube and learn whatever you want to learn, right?
Right.
But
And
yeah, yeah.
And I was going to say, it's interesting that you bring that up, because that is actually one of the culprits when you asked about the effectiveness and looking at like, why have we deviated from the science of reading? Or if this has been around since, the late 60s, early 70s, why is it that, we're now looking at 2025 and, we now see that this momentum has picked up with it. Part of it is honestly, when I went back to that initial, like the marketing, well, part of the marketing was this, I think, erroneous thinking that using the science of reading to then teach teachers and practitioners around the pedagogy and the 5 components that are essential to becoming literate, that one of those components, phonemic awareness, alphabetic principle, a lot of folks, and we could track it back to the Goodmans, you could track it back to the Clays, you could track it back. But when you looked at sort of the heart of their thinking, that was part of their call, was that, it was another way of trying to control, the masses, and that not everybody learns that way. Well, okay, yes. And people actually, yes, have different modalities of learning. And yet, science teaches us that part of that argument, people have different modalities of learning, is actually not rooted in science and research, right? Part of that argument was, well, language, you're born with your language box or the ability to be linguistically, I don't want to say sound, and there was an assumption that having language and using language as a tool would then lead to someone being able to make their best guess and to look at a word and look at the picture. And that's actually not how the brain develops. That's actually not how you develop as a reader. Language is an innate ability, just like the thinking and the understanding of numeracy is an innate building, but you actually build your reading box in your brain. And I'm using very layman terms when I say this, through your exposure to language, the alphabetic principle, sound, letter, symbol recognition, the practice of blending those sounds together, making meaning of the sounds that then formulate the word, understanding what the word is, comprehending that word within a story, comprehending it's just this one sort of staircase step after the other, and language plays the role, but it's certainly not the main mechanism to how someone learns to read. And let me say this, Ross, this is what I love about this conversation. This is why this conversation is so important. Now, I'm talking about specific researchers. I'm talking about the historical legacy around the science of reading, but I am nowhere near an expert. And I say that all the time. I am someone who, now, I have the ability to access experts. I have a phenomenal group of experts over at Core Learning, our for-profit subsidiary that has been focused on the science of reading and the teaching and coaching and supporting of structured literacy for over 25 years. We have folks out in the field that are affiliated with us, that have supported us. We have folks all over, from our friends over at Amplify to people in the Reading League. I have access to experts that when I want to know specific questions or answers, or want to know how it started or why it started, I can go to those experts. And guess what's so fascinating right now? Everybody has access to those experts. The thing that I love most, well, one of the things I love most about Emily Hanford is that not only is she a great storyteller, not only does she bring you down into the moment, but then she gives you all of this references for the research and evidence. And so I want to name, I'm not an expert. I'm a practitioner. I've been a teacher. I was an early childhood teacher, a kindergarten, first grade, second grade teacher. Certainly that lane where you are teaching reading. I've been a fifth grade teacher. So on the other side, when you receive students who are struggling with disfluency, I have been a middle school turnaround principal. So I've seen what that output looks like when you receive a 7th and 8th grader that reads on a 2nd and 3rd grade level, and what that does not only in ELA, but in math and science and their social development, right? And I've had the privilege of being I call it a bonus mom, a god mom. I've seen from the other side of the advocacy where you have your very own child that you love and adore and want to see them thrive and survive, and you watch them struggle with trying to show up as a 2nd grader and crack open a book to read it out loud to their brother or sister or cousin. You watch them fall asleep trying to memorize words because they were told that they had to memorize 100 sight words. You watch their entire just demeanor change when they know they're a struggling reader and you're witnessing them struggle. And so all of that as a culmination goes into the cauldron of why I am such an advocate and proponent of the science of reading. but I'm certainly not an expert.
Right. Yeah, well, you're an expert at certain components of what it looks like to
Yes.
ensure that, science-based instruction is happening in learning
Yes.
environments, right? That, it's certainly, I think, relates to something I was thinking about regarding the relationship and interaction between, higher education, schools of education, and K-12 schools, and that there's different types of expertise that live in each area, and that if they're not interacting, if we only have either a narrow definition of expertise, there's only one way to be an expert on this topic, or there's only one type of expertise needed, that it doesn't, to understand that there's an integrated kind of spectrum of expertise doesn't dilute the meaning of expertise. It's not the same as, that the resistance to expertise, but it's saying like there is an expertise to the person who has for 20 years been in a second grade classroom
Right.
working with students hands on. They don't
Right.
necessarily have a PhD in it, but they
Right.
know something that if somebody's been in the research realm, they don't know about. And that person there. So how do we create that urgency and the pressure between those different environments to say there's things that non-negotiably need to be a part of pre-service training, and like teachers need to come into the profession knowing this stuff, and then on the K-12 side, like there's things that need to be done and happening, right? And we need to stick with it, and like this is foundational, and we need to make the case for it. You referenced Emily and like the storytelling piece, right? One of the most memorable answers I have gotten to the question of why do we kind of backslide on this science reading thing, or if we've known about it for a long time, why does it kind of go in and out of fashion? That I now I can't remember who said it, which is, it's so memorable what they said. Now I can't, but it was basically like because it's boring. It's like you get used to doing it, and you either feel like it's a solved problem, or
Yeah.
it just, it's like when you've been doing it forever, right? It's easy to forget how novel and critical that is to a 4, 5, 6, 7 year old that's
Yeah.
never done it before. And it's like I've been doing it, and then there are other things that come into focus, whether it's, other elements around relevance, cultural responsiveness, etc. That it's like that this has to be in addition to, right? It's like
Right.
we have these foundational principles and then we build around them, but it's not a replacement for, right? I think there's a lot of reasons why that happens, but it's like a lot of it I think goes to like there's these disconnects between what it looks like to get trained into the profession, to enter the profession, to stick with it, and it's the different types of expertise that maybe feel in conflict with each other, or feel like they're not adequately respected and supported, right? That probably leads to some of the feeling of, being motivated to do things differently than what works. Is like it's like I just feel like I need to prove myself here because I'm not having a voice in this.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what's interesting about that, first about the boring piece. I don't know. I grapple with that. And right when you said it, I lost the person. I knew I sort of thought that was where you were going because other people have made that comment and now I can't even make the association between the person who said it. What I think is really interesting about that though, in terms of like because it's boring, is that and listen, I'm going to say this, I don't mean any harm if this doesn't apply to a teacher and you don't experience this as a practitioner. I know for me, the thing that fueled, first of all, I don't know any job that you have that doesn't start to become sort of boring. It's the same minutia, it's the same thing day in and day out. In any profession that you do, it's not, you look at an NBA star, they are practicing their 3 point every day. And that is not something that is titillating and, fascinating. But when they need it, when you're Indiana, you got to shoot those threes from mid court, all those boring times you were practicing come into handy.
Right.
Say that as a teacher, right? But there is something about watching a human being begin you literally get to see the reaction of when the synapses in the brain starts to make connections and the human being starts to get the sense that they are actually developing a skill. They are actually fluently reading a word. They actually understand what
Hmm.
these stream of words are saying. And then, by golly, where they have recognized that they went from recognizing letters, sounds, words, sentences, phrases to an entire story, to look up at a teacher after completing reading aloud a paragraph, and they recognize that they read it fluently and understood it and can have a conversation about it. That is the titillating part. That's the part for me that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, to watch someone in the midst of learning. And so I think that, you know, when we think about it at its raw practice form, it is a lot of technique. It is a lot of
Hmm.
understanding. It is a lot of being able to parse, I would say, bring together the understanding of what these five components are, how each of them play a role. It is Scarborough's rope and
Hmm.
understanding how that plays out. And I think that the other flip side of that, though, goes back to my original answer at the top of our discussion, is that once we have grounded ourselves, and this doesn't have to be a whole nation, you can do this as a classroom teacher or a grade level team or a school or school system. But once you begin to recognize what the purpose of education is for your community, your second round is then to efficiently and sufficiently create systems to support the practitioners that are at the helm of being the catalyst for that educational track that the students are on, right? For students' academic achievement. And what I mean by that is, when we answer that question, we then begin to look at how we are supportive of this profession. And you said it just a few minutes ago. We are closely examining who comes into the teaching cohort. What skills do they have? What skills do we need to build on? What skills do we need to ensure that they end their skill year with? Are we putting them in front of children with no skills and expecting those children to learn to read? How are we checking in to see their development as a teacher? The thing that I say all the time to leaders is that if you have struggling readers in your school, then you have struggling teachers.
Hmm.
Because a teacher who is armed with the pedagogy and the knowledge and the materials and the time, they will have less struggling readers than the teacher that has barely any of those things or one of those things out of the many. And so I think that's the other part to this is, what does it mean to be educated?
Hmm.
What does it take to ensure that the professionals that are being asked to be the catalyst of education are prepared, sustained, nurtured, career trajectored in your system, so that without just any doubt that regardless of the student that's coming in, I know that this practitioner can meet this student where they are. It's like your doctor, Ross. I know when you go into the doctor's office, you're assuming that this doctor is well prepared. And I don't know about you, if you've been into a doctor's office where they have a resident and they say, "Oh, I want the resident to examine you." There's a part in your mind where you're like, "Oh God, okay, I'm glad the doctor's in here because I
Yeah.
don't want them to I don't want them to misread my blood pressure." It's the same thing in school. We need that same tenet around the professions that we hold for doctors. We need those same tenets that we hold. We need to hold those same tenets for teachers and their development around how to teach reading.
Yeah,
Structure.
absolutely. Yeah, and I feel like it all, connects together, because I could certainly see how when the profession is presented and treated in such a way that an individual teacher feels like there's no role for what they personally bring to the job, right? Or no outlet kind of for their creativity or their individual knowledge and expertise, that you can resist something that feels like you're just being given a step by step, like do exactly these things, and everybody can do it exactly the same way. And you're not understanding, like to your basketball example, if you're practicing a certain fundamental skill, right, a post move or whatever, and you never get to apply it against an opponent. You never play in a game. All you do every day is you're by yourself in the gym doing that one thing for eternity, right? Eventually, it's probably going to seem kind of pointless because it's like you don't have that context. But then once you get into the competition and you realize I need this as my foundation, and now I am going to need to adapt it or add to it or apply it a little differently because the defender I'm going against is playing me differently or they have a different strength, right? And now you see how it comes together. Where if you go right into the game and you've never practiced and you don't have those skills, you don't even know what to do when you're struggling. Same thing with the teaching, right? Okay, once I have these foundations down, now I can identify the student is struggling. What's the part where they're getting stuck? Or what's the thing that's not connecting? And now I can adapt. I can find a way to relate to them. I can use intervention to reinforce the skills, whatever I need to do. If I'm going into it without the foundation, I'm just kind of lost. And that's taking me to the role, like, of school leadership, administration, what they need to be doing. And it doesn't just relate to this, but this is a great example of I don't know, you know, it's certainly not universal. I don't know how consistent it is, but the attention that administration pays to these instructional practices, their involvement in it, and the role as that visionary, like, and motivating leader that is able to get teachers interested in and bought into the practices that everybody really needs to be doing, figuring out how to appropriately provide the right professional learning when we have implementation of tools that are meant to support different needs. How are we making that happen in a way that doesn't feel overwhelming or it's an add-on? But I feel like those latter parts are, you can do them more effectively when you're starting with really having good knowledge of what are the practices, why are we doing it. Like, I can describe why we're doing it if I understand why we're doing it. I still need to describe it, but if I don't understand it myself, or I'm just not attentive to that, then it is hard to get the across the board consistent application. And then there is going to be variance of these teachers over here know things really well, they're doing it in these classrooms, the students are not really being well served because their teachers are not applying the practices.
Yep. Yeah, I think, well, one, I can't believe I'm I can't believe I'm about to stretch this basketball analogy, but let me say this. When you take the time out to support and garner and stretch and develop teachers' knowledge and application around structured literacy, you will have win far more championships than any other NBA or NFL or any other sports team, because you will inevitably have children that exit out of your room that will have that skill set that are prepared and perhaps even over prepared for the next grade. And here's the thing, it starts to cure your system's turnover rate. You will have a system that have educators in it for the longevity because they're winning every year, because they're seeing that their hard work and their understanding and their application and their development of what they know to be true about those 5 components of literacy applied in a structured literacy environment. They see the evidence of that. Now, here's the thing that you're saying about the leader that I sort of push up against a little bit. Taking this basketball analogy, there are basketball coaches out there that have never won a championship, that have never played on a winning championship game, right? Team. And yet they understand the strategy, the skill set, the mindset, the practice, the attitude, the conditions that are needed to make those athletes become champions, right? So
Mhm.
I say this to leaders all the time. I hear leaders like, well, reading wasn't my thing, math wasn't. That's fine. But you
Right.
understand as a leader all the conditions, the environment, the support, what your practitioners are going to need in order to understand how structured literacy should be systematized and stood up in your building. But here's the other thing that's the difference from the teacher leader and the coach. You see, a coach of a winning NBA team is not asked to run the budget.
Mm-hmm.
They're not asked to evaluate every single coach, every single referee, every single custodian, every single secretary. They're not asked to go in and give their synopsis of what each person's doing. They're not asked to check the lead levels in their water out of the water fountain. They're not asked to make sure that the materials count. All of the pressure, not just even pressure, all of the expectations that fall on our school leaders today. I don't know anyone other than, and I'm really not saying this facetiously, other than someone in the military at wartime that has to think about multiple things at multiple times in multiple areas in order to ensure that everyone is surviving from the beginning to the end of the day. I know this because I played that role. Mm-hmm. So for you to ask me then to make decisions or to be on top of how literacy is being literate, or I would say how structured literacy is being stood up in my building. Well, one, who showed me? What do I know about? Where's my knowledge set? Two, what are the conditions that I have that are with me that's going to help me evaluate, observe in a true way, not just to get through the evaluations because your principal supervisor is hounding you to hand it into central office. So I think that there's a lot of, and I say this all the time, people have this image, including people in our school systems, that like teachers and leaders are magical beings and that somehow they supersede the human ability right. to hold cognitive dissonance to do all of those things at once. And there are some leaders who do it very well. There are some leaders who are hearing this that are struggling, that are probably like saying amen in their car. And there are other leaders, quite frankly, who make a decision on a daily basis to ignore all that other stuff and only focus on their students' reading, writing, and mathematical ability. But I just, again, think that goes back to how we as a society, a community, a nation, need to start thinking about the way we think about education, the way we think about supporting those that are standing in front of students, and most importantly, the way we think about the systems that aren't working and how to deconstruct and reconstruct those systems so that all students walk out of our K-12 buildings literate, fluent citizens of the world.
Yeah, ultimately, I mean, that's the goal, right? And it needs to be, okay, how are we creating an environment where there's not, every student in every classroom in this school is being well served by where they are, right? And that we're not like in the back or the front of our minds, like we better move around these rosters because we got to kind of, and look, there are realities to practitioners who are at a different stage of their expertise, or have been at it longer, are newer, are developing, and that needs to be supported with capacity building. But if we're like persistently and accepting the fact that there's just always these couple of rooms that we're trying to cover up, like what's a potential solution to that? What do leadership teams look like? How are we empowering teacher leadership and building, like ensuring that there is a chain of accountability leading to outcomes, right? That it's not about one person trying to do everything or two people, but saying like these things need to be accounted for. There's people who know this really well, who are close to it, and how are we making sure that happens? And understand that the skill sets are different, right? On the sports side, your player, coach, front office, it's different skill set. It doesn't necessarily translate. One thing could give you insights that helps with the other. But if you're the general manager of the team, you didn't have to have played at all. But if you don't know what makes a good player, you can't be
Exactly.
good at your job, right? So you still have
Exactly.
to know how to identify that, how to cultivate that, how to put the right pieces in position to make things happen, and then focus on what you're focusing on. You can't be the one at practice every day, putting in the work. You're not down on the sideline drawing up the plays, but you need to have the right people there doing the right things, knowing what their job is. So a lot of parts there, and it's a whole team. And and these roles should have more. They shouldn't just be operating in isolation, right? Or
Right.
like, and there's great opportunity in that too, because
Yep.
it makes it, it's also what teachers want, right? They want those when they're ready to take on those leadership roles and when they have insights that they want to be imparting to their colleagues. Like, they want a mechanism for making that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. 100%.
Excellent. Well, this conversation could go on and on, I'm sure. We'll figure out how to summarize and pull it together. Here's what I would ask. I'm going to take it from this side of things. So there's when we go back to the science of reading, there's maybe the more common question around what the misconceptions are, what people who are not, totally up to speed on it might not understand. But I think even maybe a more productive question right now, what's incomplete potentially if the only thing we know about reading instruction is science of reading? What else do we need to be thinking about to say, yes, like this thing is critical, it has to be there?
Mhm.
And then also, let's think about these components, what goes with it. That could be something that has to do with personnel, practice, how we relate to students, whatever you think. But what's the next thing, basically? Like, once we've got this down and we've committed to it and we're not straying from it, all right, now we need to also focus on these other things.
Yep. So I think people understanding, I want to start with like the basics. I say this every single time. People understanding when we talk about I call them the five key components for successful reading instruction. So there's the phonemic awareness,
Hmm.
phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. And I think when we say science of reading, because of that ill marketing, because of that sort of early politicizing it, people tend to land around the phonemic awareness and the phonics. And I know in the beginning there was all this struggle, like it's not just phonics, it's fluency, but
Hmm.
that's not what the science of reading does not say. Forgo fluency and vocabulary to focus on phonemic awareness. It talks about those five components being in conjunction together, and that it is important that there is a focus on each one of those components, sometimes in a together, sometimes in a separate, in an isolated way, but they have to be there. So I think I want people to understand that when they hear the science of reading, particularly my parents, particularly my community members, it's not just about phonemic awareness, even though phonemic awareness is important. Alphabetic principle is important. When you think about the science of reading, you cannot make it or distill it or pull it away from what structured literacy is. And structured literacy is going to stand on making sure that your structured literacy time has explicit instruction in it, has systematic instruction in it, has multisensory instruction, word recognition, decoding, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension, and it is a cumulative instruction that's going on. And
Hmm.
I think that people need to understand what the components of structured literacy look like for elementary, how they graduate up in middle school, and certainly what is now the output of a literate reader and writer in high school that is college and career bound. So I think it's important that folks look at that, like the continuation of not just if you're a struggling reader in first grade, a struggling reader in fifth grade, a struggling reader in ninth grade. But let's start with if I have given you access to these components, if I've taught them in a structured literacy way, what then does your educational academic pathway look like? And what should I expect of you at each stage? Right? I think that oftentimes when people talk about the science of reading, when people talk about those five components or structured literacy, it's always to me in a deficit way. It's always with the struggling reader in mind. And I
Hmm.
push practitioners and leaders to let's start where our vision is going with this. Because that at the end of the day is going to help drive you back to the why, right? That at the end of the day is going to help drive you back to your belief systems about the students and the teachers that are before you and their capability, right, of adapting, innovating, and learning around the science of reading and certainly becoming literate in their track. So I want people to be able to move past the whole science of reading title, thinking that it only means phonics, understanding it comes in a structured literacy hour. And here's the final piece. This is the most beautiful part of all of this. I want people to understand the role that language plays in this. That students that come from multilingual, bilingual households, that students that come from households that have a specific English vernacular, that have a variation of English in their households, that those students are coming with assets to our classrooms. And that when we capitalize on their linguistic assets, when we see them as a part of their superpower as a student, we can then begin to utilize language as a powerful tool in the development of reading. And most importantly, students' agency as a learner can begin from the very onset when they step into our schoolhouses. And so I really want to push folks, if you don't have an understanding about it, please do the research. You can go to Emily Hanford. You can start with the podcast, or you simply type into the web. Go, God forbid you use your AI component and say, tell me what structured literacy is, and then go have the conversation with your colleagues and other parents and other folks in the community. That is how we begin, or we continue this movement in this nation and ensure ourselves that we don't do this whole back and forth politicizing around it, that we ensure that at the end of the day, every citizen, every person in these United States can pursue happiness because they are literate. They understand how literacy helps with their writing, and they are mathematical thinkers. And all of that comes back to who you are as a reader.
Absolutely. That's perfect conclusion. And yeah, a lot of good things to check out. Is there anything else, listeners, you'd like us to check out on your website or elsewhere after this conversation if they want to learn more about what you're working on?
Absolutely. I invite everybody to come to unbounded.org. We have a GLEAM framework that undergirds everything that we do. Is a grade level engaging, affirming, meaningful instruction. Our for-profit subsidiary CORE, as I said, has a formidable stake in this nation around the science of reading, the coaching, the teaching. We have a program, an online program called HOLA, and it's the Online Language and Literacy Academy. If you want to know more, if you want to gain your instructional legs around the teaching of reading using language at the center of design, please come and check out CORE Learnings, core.org learnings website, as well as UnboundEd. And join us at our National Institute. We have one in June in Denver, Colorado. You can look up on our website, and one in July in Atlanta, Georgia.
Excellent. Well, check it all out, folks. We'll put the links below, make it easy. You can click around and find everything there. You can also find our previous conversation about justice seekers. We'll put the link there to where you can find the book. And so everything that was mentioned here, it's right there for you. Check that out. Please also do subscribe to The Authority if you're not already. We'll have more interviews coming your way every week, or visit bpodcast.network to learn about all of our shows. Lacey, thanks again for being here.
Thank you for having me.